I want to welcome you to the second annual Irene Casteel Endowed Speaker Keynote. It is my pleasure as the chair of the Irene Casteel Endowed Chair of Education, Professional, and Social Sciences to welcome you. My name is Dr. Shane Tillman. I'm Associate Professor of Writing and Multimedia Studies at Ohio University. This wonderful keynote has been sponsored and underwritten by the Committee on Cultural Special Events, the School of Social Sciences and Human Interaction, and the Writing and Multimedia Studies program. This keynote is honoring the memory of Irene Casteel, who was a 1925 alumni of Ohio University. She was born in Payne, Ohio in 1902. She followed in her father Edward Wall's footsteps as an alumni of Ohio University. While on campus, Irene was involved in Tau Kappa Kappa sorority, the Fiddleionian Literary Society, the Educational Association, the Math Association, and the St. Celia Society. In addition, she served on the YWCA cabinet and was a student delegate to the National Conference at Lake Geneva. Irene Casteel Auditorium and the Irene Casteel Drama Award is named in her honor as she spent a majority of her time teaching at Continental High School in Ohio. It is my honor to present her memory in recognition of this wonderful keynote series. The series itself is designed to focus on issues that the general public isn't talking about that is 5 years down the road. This future sighted style series is in recognition of her groundbreaking and future sighted work that she has done through the course of her life. To introduce our keynote speaker, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ray.
Tobias S. Buckell is a New York Times bestselling author and World Fantasy Award winner who was born in the Caribbean. He grew up in Grenada and spent time in the British and U.S. Virgin Islands, which continue to influence much of his work. His novels and almost 100 short stories, some of which have been translated into 20 different languages. His work has been nominated for awards like the Hugo, Nebula, World Fantasy, and Astounding Award for Best New Science Fiction Author. He currently lives in Bluffton, Ohio, where he teaches creative writing at Bluffton University. If you are wondering why a religion professor is introducing him, I get this honor because Toby and his wife Emily are dear friends who I am fortunate to see a couple of times a week. As my students can attest, I am not an expert in popular culture. And I will state publicly that much of what I do know about popular culture I learned in Toby's living room. So I'm thrilled that the ONU community gets another opportunity to learn from him. So help me welcome distinguished author, futurist, and dear friend, Tobias S. Buckell to the podium.
Well, good afternoonish, early evenish. Pleased to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I'll start off with just a little bit of a personal anecdote here. I am a futurist and an author. I grew up in the Caribbean in Grenada. Grenada is a small island almost all the way down near South America, for those of you who are not familiar with your geography. Only Trinidad and Tobago are kind of closer to South America. I've been fascinated by stories ever since I was a kid. Whether the Billy Goat's Gruff or any one of those wonderful Hans Christian Andersen stories, I would have them read to me at school. And I would also have these Anansi stories told to me by my family, my Caribbean side of my family. Anansi tales have come all the way down from Africa into the Caribbean. And I would even listen to this man by the name of Paul Keynes Douglas tell stories over the radio about a woman named Auntie Merle, and that were very popular when I was growing up. And I imprinted on all of this really, really hard. I was a tousle-headed, overly tanned, wild child who either roamed the beach near the boat we lived and I grew up on, and I haunted these things that we had in the islands called take one, leave one libraries. long before those little free libraries, sorry about that, long before these little free libraries that dot our country here appeared, we would have these things in the islands called take one, leave one libraries. And they were often found in marinas or just centers where a lot of people were passing through, particularly sailors. And there'd be a shelf or a corner somewhere in the back with a bunch of old, dusty, dingy, kind of moldy smelling paperbacks. And a sign that usually said, in magic marker, take one, leave one. And I have to confess, at 7 or 8, I probably took a lot more books than I left. A little book thief, because I was building up my own personal library at the time. I consumed story. I'm dyslexic and ADHD, but my mother told me a book is like a movie in your head. And because of that, 2 things kind of happened to me. One, as I said, I lived on a boat. I don't ever see a small handful of movies when visiting friends on shore or at their houses. We lived basically an off-grid sort of life. So we didn't have the power, because of that, to run a VCR or a TV. We lived alone on the boat, more or less. You know, you were kind of isolated. So books were my main entertainment, and I read a lot. And no one ever told me that it took longer to read a book than a movie. Because of that, I thought that if a book was a movie in my head, I needed to speed this operation up quite a bit and read a lot faster than I was reading if I was going to ever kind of compress a book into a 2 to 3 hour experience. And coincidentally, I found that the faster I read, the less confused I was by the text, because I could parse meaning from chains of words, which helped with my dyslexia. And the slower I read, the more I struggled. The faster I read, the more I might miss, but overall, the more story I could kind of understand and grasp. So to summarize, I read a lot, and I read really fast. By the time I was in junior high, I was reading more than a book a day in between classes instead of doing any homework, and then at home instead of doing any chores. I read so many stories so fast that I began to notice stories all around me. This isn't uncommon for a writer to start to make a narrative out of the world around you. In fact, it's not uncommon for anyone to create narrative out of the universe around us. I have a lot of personal narratives, and I think you all probably do as well. In fact, I'm telling you a narrative right now, the one I formed about how I came to be a fast reader and how that impacted my grades in school, and how eventually I began to write a lot because teachers started taking my books away in about 9th grade, where it stopped being, oh cute, he's reading in class, and you're defying my authority. But it's just a narrative. It ignores many of the paths I could have taken and almost took. I'm telling you a story to explain why I started to notice story all around me and how I became a writer. In fact, I'll even tell you one of the first stories I began to notice people telling themselves that I felt I had to kind of unpack and understand. I'm from the Caribbean. I'm biracial, and even though I look white, my father is Caribbean. Family photos from my childhood show one very pale, very blonde, very awkward me with all my Caribbean family. I kind of stand out. That's okay. I'm telling you all this because my family are hard workers. The Caribbean side of my family are fishermen, boat builders, farmers, artists. In the past, they cut banana, loaded banana, built roads, sailed between the islands in small wooden boats to create an entire indigenous shipping industry. They have made do and worked and worked and worked harder than I will ever work a day in my life. My mother's British. That's where all of this comes from, right? She comes from this peasant stock. During the pandemic, I spent all this time researching our genealogy to find out more about my past, and found out that my mother's family, in the UK, there's this thing where if you look into your past, you don't have to throw your genetic stone very far into the pond to find some random duke or minor royalty that you can say you're related to. It's kind of half the fun of doing genealogy if you have any British background. And when I found out that was no royalty in any of my family lineage, which is actually kind of hard to pull off. My mother's family basically were peasants in a small town north of London for 500 years, or fisher folk in Wales for almost 500 years. So my mother is British, and I grew up in the Caribbean, which means through her I knew a lot of the local expats in the area. For those of you who don't know what an expat is, it's short for expatriate. It refers to someone who's moved from one country to another, but often retains the loyalty, customs, language, and affinity for their prior culture. Now see, white people who live in another country hate being called immigrants, so we have a special term, expatriates. Immigrants are non-white, non-English speaking people from one country moving to another. Expatriates are white English speaking people who move from one country to another. And that's the first time I started to perceive the weaponization of story, okay? Expatriates called people like my Caribbean family lazy. Even as I saw my family drinking a beer, exhausted from a hard day's work, from cutting cane, from fishing, from building boats. Were there a lot of cross-cultural miscommunications? Yeah. But most of this often came down to some deep curiosity from expatriates about alacrity and timekeeping and the culture of time at different times. The culture I grew up in is not a timekeeping culture. The West usually is. Where I grew up, people show up when they show up. Further, even here in the US, people who are often poorly paid adjust their effort accordingly. We work to the job. It's a well-known economic response that individuals have. And Westerners who would come to the country I grew up in to offshore work or pay people very little, that was the whole appeal for them, to create factories and pay far less than they were paying people in the US. So people often slow-walked. They worked to the job. But we were lazy. This was the first time I realized that stories could be dangerous and how they could be wielded against entire people. This was when I realized that metaphors could be weapons and the craft of the thing I love the most in this world, story. That craft could be used in some scary ways. So I want to talk to you about metaphor. Metaphor is one of the base units of story and one of the most powerful. So what is a metaphor, really quickly? Not because I think you're not smart, but just so that we have some common understanding really quickly. A metaphor is this really interesting linguistic trick where we describe something by comparing it to something it isn't. It really isn't. Onions, right, have many layers. Oops, I'm sorry. That was supposed to be struck out. There's a line through it, and I started reading it. My apologies. A simile is similar to a metaphor, but it compares two different things, right? My mind is like an onion, it has many layers, okay? My mind operates like a computer, and I don't have enough RAM, so I never remember things. That's a metaphor, right? So now I'm going to drop some quick theory on you. The metaphor has these two parts, okay? There's the tenor. That's like the subject. Life is, okay? Think about Tom Hanks. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get next, okay? The tenor is the subject, life. Life is. The tenor is life. That's the thing we're going to compare something else to. Life is like a box of chocolates. The second part is called the vehicle. That's the thing you're comparing it to. Life is the tenor, chocolates is the vehicle. See, in fiction, I think the vehicle of metaphor constantly, I think about the vehicle of metaphor constantly because I'm trying to figure out how I'm manipulating the reader into understanding something, okay? Writers use it to create emotion and novelty. We've taken readers and we've put them in MRI machines, and we've read to them, and we've studied the brain activity as they're hearing narrative. And what we found out about the neuroscience of reading is that when we use metaphors and similes, the brain lights up in some really fascinating ways that it doesn't light up for other writing, okay? When we use a metaphor, our brain goes into the depths of memory and recalls any association it has with the vehicle, and then conflates that with the tenor, and then restores everything we've just done back into deep memory with a new link, a neural link, to the association connecting our tenor and our vehicle together forever as you put it into your deep storage. Life is like a box of chocolates. In the MRI machine, most people will recall, and their brain will light up with imagery related to chocolates and their chocolate experiences throughout their life, all right? It's kind of like if I say, don't think about a giant gray elephant, you're sort of compelled to immediately think about a giant gray elephant. Don't do it. Don't think about a giant gray elephant. You still pull it out of deep storage and think about a giant gray elephant, you see? So that same way, metaphor shows up like a giant elephant in your head. You can't help but recall what a box of chocolates is like for you. For me, when I say box of chocolates, I think Whitman's sampler. That's like what I associate most with one. I can smell it, like right now, as I say it. I can hear the crinkle of those little wrappers, those like little wafery wrappers. The feel, the way it slides open, okay? I pull those memories out of a deep storage area and into temporary memory space, according to neuroscience. And because I'm invited to think of life as being like a box of chocolates, I bring the vehicle forward and tie it to my understanding of the tenor of life now. And I begin to forever associate life with that. This moment of accessing the old memory, examining and putting it away is a really fascinating moment for a writer. And we utilize it a lot, whether we know it or not, to shift how you all see and experience things in our writing. We create a type of artificial synesthesia for the reader. We do this to mess with you creatively, to surprise and delight you by making unexpected comparisons that you've never considered before. And that opens you up and makes you a wider human being, okay? Terry Pratchett, the famous author of much humorous writing, but surprisingly deeper than you might expect, says it's telling a lie to help us understand what we, and by we he means the author, to be true. We delight the reader by saying things like this: she herself is a haunted house. She does not possess herself. Her ancestors sometimes come and peer out of the windows of her eyes, and that is very frightening. That's from The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories by Angela Carter, right? It's a really neat little metaphor, the person as a haunted house, haunted by their ancestors. In literature, we drop things like this to get a more direct, less clumsy, more poetical comparison. But come on, you can't literally be a haunted house, can you? That's the lie. You're not a haunted house, you're a human being. You're a full, complete human being. Your skin is not lath. Your eyes are not actually windows. None of this is real. Angela Carter takes the tenor, which is the she, the character that Carter wishes you to understand on a deeper level, without summarizing a bunch about that person. She does not want to get into the complexities of the human. She just wants to draw the comparison by making a metaphor. Carter invites us to consider that this person, as being like a haunted house, makes that vehicle come up from your memories. You don't know much about this character, but you probably all have some preconceptions about haunted houses. This is a concept that you're very familiar with, and you're now going to attach neural links to this character that tie into your own sensations, memories, and feelings of haunted houses, all right? We artists use this moment when our readers pull a deep memory out to interrupt you and use your memories and imagination to build a platform on which we can build and virtualize people, places, things, and experiences in a way we can't by just simply listing their attributes. In a way we actually slightly rewire your brain in this moment as we tell story. It's a beautiful thing in art. It's intimate. It requires trust. And I suspect this is why some people are often really deeply suspicious of fiction, as it requires empathy and intimacy. But this interrupt cycle, this moment where you've pulled the vehicle up from your deep memory and are comparing it to the tenor, is a really dangerous thing as well. The danger of using a metaphor is that I'm being given access to your brain at a particularly vulnerable moment, right after you've pulled up a trusted and personal memory, a set of associations with the vehicle. And then I'm mixing them with the tenor, and then asking you to put those memories back with new associations that forever link those two things together. It's an incredible responsibility. The first time I noticed metaphor being weaponized like this, the first time I recognized weaponized metaphor was when I first came to the US through my stepdad. My stepdad follows US politics closely due to being a Midwesterner, and once told me he'd be voting for a president he liked because my stepdad thought government should be run like a business. Please don't groan, right? I know some of you are thinking you're going to touch the third rail and talk about politics. I kind of am, but I kind of am not. I'm going to talk about it because it fascinates me, because I'm not going to suggest which side is correct, but I am fascinated by this metaphor. First of all, can we all agree this is a metaphor? The government is the tenor, the subject, and business is our vehicle, right? We're trying to marry a concept to another concept. Now in the US, we live in a capitalist society as founded by individuals who set it up that way. From the essays of Adam Smith to the Founding Fathers, America views business as positive, right? America is in business and is in business to be America. I'm not saying who's right or wrong, I'm just describing who this is, who we are as a country. Americans value and hold up and have really positive feelings about a lot of business. Business built America, right? Industry. Business went to work during World War II to create the machinery we needed to arm the arsenal of democracy, right? But a metaphor is, as we explained, fundamentally a lie. We're comparing something to something it isn't. So government should be run like a business is a wonderful metaphor. I take my hat off as a writer because I can see how it works and so effectively. We pull the concept of business out of long-term memory, and for most Americans it's historically positive, and then we link it to government. The moment you hear this metaphor, you're slightly inclined, if you believe that business is any good, and most of the target audience for this metaphor are already primed to have positive associations with business, to agree with it, use it, and spread it. But pretty fundamentally, regardless of your philosophy, we all know that government is not a business, because a metaphor is not true, and that's a metaphor. So when we use metaphors outside of art, we're lying about something that we believe to be true, right? If we believe Terry Pratchett. Because again, a government is not literally a business any more than Angela Carter's character was a house. They're not even the same class of structure. A business doesn't have 100% of all possible customers under the roof of its store. A business can't print currency. A business can't set interest rates on external credit or loans. A business has to get loans within a regulatory framework. A business exists within a governmental structure and legal system that hangs over it. A business can choose not to serve customers. A government cannot. It can target certain customers with coupons to scare up new business. A business is interested in extraction. It's built on the premise of trying to get money from its customers and more money than it spends to get them. A business can fold, it can shut down, it can be sold to other owners. A business doesn't have its managers voted in by its customers. A business is not really beholden to customers in many ways, but to shareholders and owners. A government can't fire its customers. It's beholden to a polity, and to that entire polity. Just from that, the metaphor breaks. You can't have layoffs to save a government because that's called genocide, and we fought damaging and destructive wars about that. Although some governments do go rogue, we don't generally expect governments to hold mass layoffs every couple of years of their citizens. A government has to serve all of its customers. That's why it was created, and it's fundamentally a different creature. And because of those deep fundamental differences, that metaphor breaks the moment we begin to explore it just a little bit deeply, regardless of your political affiliation. Let's do another one quick on the other side. Years ago, will.i.am, the Haitian rap artist, famously said, "People say Romney ran businesses and that means he should be president, but America isn't a business. America needs to be like a parent. What's good for our kids and where are they going to school and how can you guide them?" Now, this is another metaphor, right? Business should be like a family. will.i.am spots the issue with the CEO and business metaphor, but he looks for something else to replace it with and decides to go with family. So let's look at these associations really quickly. Family, for many of us, family is positive, right? Nurturing and charge, for many of us. Not all of us, but for many of us. So that sounds good. But as many people pointed out, will.i.am makes the same mistake that the other metaphor makes, because a country is not a family. When a government cuts aid to the poor, there's the possibility of a church or a community picking up slack or family so that people don't starve. Our president is not married to our Supreme Court. Citizens are not children. A family can't print its own money. A family can't set loan rates. A family doesn't field its own military. Are there some things that kind of, maybe if we use even more metaphors to make more comparisons, kind of similar? Yeah, but comparisons aren't the thing. They're comparisons. They're lies that we tell to sort of explain a truth. This comes up when you see a really famous metaphor which compares the government's budget to your family budget. This happens a lot on Facebook. I see a graphic showing the total US debt and dividing it by the number of citizens. And out of that, you get a number that's roughly $102,000 per citizen. And that seems like a scary amount per person. And if the metaphor of a household budget is true, then a graphic that shows a worker groaning under the weight of $100,000 worth of government bills makes a very arresting point. But is it true? Well, a family earns money through its older workers going out to bring back money. A government makes money through import taxes, taxing businesses, citizens, sales tax, and a variety of other methods that families don't have access to, generally. I can't tax my 14-year-old who has no job, though they do some help around the house. Generally, I don't view my kids as resources or citizens within my family. The US government budget includes debts that are owed between parts of the country that are included in that 100,000. In fact, a large amount of US debt is not owed outside the US. It's owed to businesses within the US, citizens within the US, and between branches of government. If you give me a cookie in my family and I promise to hit you back later, that doesn't go on a ledger of debt. You just gave me a cookie and I'm hoping to give you one back later. But it does in the government, and that is listed as debt. A metaphor is a lie we tell to show a truth we believe. In art, it's a clever way of creating more novelty. In life, it's a very powerful tool. It simplifies complex issues so that we don't have to wrestle too hard with them. You can communicate a policy decision with a metaphor. The person's brain will light up as they recall the vehicle, and it will forever shift how they see the tenor of the metaphor. This is a dangerous place, and it's about to get more fraught in the next 5 years. Here's where I do a little Q&A with an audience with some information. So just get ready for that. I want some back and forth between us, because I've been talking a lot. That makes me nervous. So why is this all a problem? Why is having bad metaphors scattered around us such a pressing issue? I mean, how can saying all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, which is a line from As You Like It by one Mr. William Shakespeare, dangerous? Well, the problem comes from another literary great, Mark Twain, who said, "A lie can get halfway around the world before the truth even puts its pants on." He said that in the age of telegraph and printed news. And if it was true in the 1800s, it is way more true now than ever before. Right now, due to the speed of light and server TCP/IP protocols, we clever humans can transmit a lie around the world, not just halfway, but all the way in 0.0002 seconds. That's how fast it can spread. Truth doesn't stand a chance at that speed. And in a hyper-capitalistic world where news is no longer a nonprofit arm of a TV broadcast company, news survives on an attention economy because most online news is funded by your clicks on the ads that are near the story, if not the number of eyeballs that are on the story. That's how they make their money. That means our media runs not on a complex education of issues, as in the classroom, but mainly on what gets you to click on that headline. That's it. All the incentives are for spread and rapidity. You don't have to assume malice or spin or conspiracy to see that modern news has a dilemma, and that is incentivized to spread something if you'll click on it, regardless of its correctness. As a result, breaking the news, being first, not being the most right, is the pressure. The pressure is to produce and produce quickly. And a further wrinkle is social media. The repost or retweet allows you to spend a small nugget of information, an idea, forward. A meme, which is often a metaphor buried in a post that has an image to help you connect the tenor to the vehicle for you, with the added benefit of some visual stimulus, which the monkey brain really likes, to help you draw it from long-term memory and prime you. But simply, it's really no surprise there's an entire war being fought over the Ukraine. Not in its lands, but on our browsers, as thousands of internet warriors funded by the governments of various countries battle to give you memes and information to influence you. This is the water we swim in right now, and like fish, it can be hard to see because it's constant, it's a fire hose. I'll give you another anecdote about how persistent these frames and metaphors can be, and how invisible they can be once they get baked into our conversation. All the way back to the time of the Greeks, we have records that show beekeepers recognized that there was one bee that others ranked under, right? There was some kind of bee hierarchy in the hive, and Aristotle wrote about it, and he dubbed it a king bee. That's a king bee. Can you see the metaphor? Bees are like monarchies, right? That's the implicit metaphor in there. Aristotle, aware of human monarchy and living in a patriarchal society, figured the head bee at the tip of the apex was a dude bee. And that's okay, we all make mistakes, and it helped him understand the bees a little better. But the problem is the metaphor, implicit as it was, is hard to detect and stuck. And for many cultures in the Western world, it was a king bee for almost 2,000 years. For 2,000 years, it was king bee. Even after scientists observed king bees laying eggs, they still were grappling with how does a male bee lay eggs? What do we have to learn about nature that will help us understand this? Until in England in the 1800s, something really strange happened. Queen Victoria, right during the Age of Enlightenment, right as we're getting scientists. And scientists started to wonder, in the Victorian age, if England had a queen at the top, and England was a monarchy, maybe, just maybe, the head bee was a queen bee. 2,000 years, because a metaphor and frame stuck. 2,000 years. That's the power of a really good metaphor. Surely poetical language and metaphors aren't that dangerous, Toby. Well, you're thinking metaphors and stories really don't affect me. I'm smart. I'm a college professor. I'm a student. I teach truths. I'm expanding my horizons and learning many, many new things. So I'm not going to pick on you directly, but I'm going to repeat a little trick that I was once an audience member for that challenged my understanding of how easily we're infected by these things. Because we've been depending on story to understand the world around us, and we pick up stories we're told constantly. And once they're read into our deep storage, it's hard to undo the learning that happened without us realizing we're exposed to something wrong. So I'm going to show you a question up here. I'm going to ask you the question up here. How did the number of deaths per year from natural disasters change over the last 100 years? Has it doubled, remained about the same, or decreased to less than half? So I'm going to ask you, how many people think the number of deaths from natural disasters have changed in this age of climate change and storms? Are we losing more people? Have we doubled? How many people would vote for doubled? 1, 2, any other takers? All right, 2 of you vote for that. How many think it's remained about the same? 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. How many think it's decreased to less than half? Only 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. All right, that's the popular one. It's decreased to less than half. You're right. You're a very well-educated and well-informed audience. But 84% of people answer wrongly. They don't have access to this data, right? 84% of just your community believes that the number of deaths have increased due to natural disasters. Let's get another one going on. I've got 3 of these for you. How many people in the world have access to electricity? How many people would vote for 30%? Nobody? All right. How many people think it's about 60%? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Oh, 4. Okay, we've got 4. Oh, you're holding your hand up too?
Yep.
5. Okay. Most of you think it's about 60%. How many think it's 90%? 3? Okay. All right. Most of us voted for 60%, so we're going to answer that on the poll. Oh, we were wrong. It's 90%. 90% of the entire globe has access to electricity, right? But that's not what you hear as the story, right? Somehow, most of us have been convinced, 78% of us have been convinced, right, that we live in an age of darkness, literally, but we don't. A lot of people have electricity. This one's fun to do with cell phones, too. All right, here's the last one. This is the one that you're starting to see what I'm doing, so you're kind of calibrating your answers, I guess, but we'll still try it. In the last 20 years, the proportion of people living in extreme poverty has more than halved. How many of you would say it's more than halved? Extreme poverty, got 2 votes, 3 votes for that. All right, remained more or less the same. 1 person, all right, almost doubled. No, okay, all right, so more than half was with 3 votes. Congratulations, we got it. But look at that, 88% of people answer this wrongly, 88%. These come from a website called Gapminder. If you haven't explored Gapminder, it's one of my favorite websites in the world because Hans Rosling created it, and Hans Rosling did this wonderful presentation where he goes through this with an audience. He first looked into this because he gave a sociology quiz to his doctoral students. And he was finding that 80 to 90% of his students were getting the wrong answer about the state of our world. How many people were living in incredible poverty? How many people had access to electricity? How many people had access to phones, cell phones, right? And he realized that if people are answering 80 to 90% in one way, that was the opposite of reality. It was not so much that they were uninformed, but that they were misinformed. In other words, if people were guessing randomly or there was noise and it was just information that had been scattered at us, they should be able to randomly get the answer right. The signal was that they were always getting the answers wrong, which showed that there was an a larger picture of misinformation, and that began to fascinate him. And he began to create Gapminder did that pop up on the screen?
No, that's...
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, I did verbalize it, so hopefully everyone got to see that. I did have the laptop plugged in here. I'm so sorry about that. All right. So, what is fascinating about just doing a quick poll like that is I can see, usually in a larger group of people, it starts to get into that 70 to 80% of people getting it wrong all the time. And I find that utterly fascinating. And if you'd like to take this test for yourself, go to Hans Rosling's Gapminder, and you can take these quizzes yourself and see if your reflection of the world around us matches the data that we have. All right, and you can see how they came up with a lot of the data. So this leads me to the question, why are we swimming in so much mis and disinformation? Well, one reason is we actually have people out there who want this. I mentioned Russia. They're one of the largest producers of metaphoric and mimetic warfare, intended to cause chaos within this country. During the pandemic, researchers found that many examples of Black Lives Matter protest Facebook pages were created by, not all of them, but many, as in they made a lot of them, were created by Russian governmental entities. And a whole number of anti-Black Lives Matter protest group pages on Facebook were created by Russian governmental entities. They were pouring fuel as they saw into both sides of the fire. And both pages created and scheduled protests for same-day, same-location events, with the intent of trying to get these two groups to fight, all right? Like putting two groups into a ring and letting them batter it out. Russia hopes and is trying to create conflict and civil unrest inside of the US society. It's open secret. They talk about it on their night shows. This is not like conspiracy talk theory. It's pretty well accepted stuff. And if you would like to, you can go on YouTube and watch Russian translations of their evening talk news. It's inherently a fascinating rabbit hole to get lost down. And the hope and stated aim is that the US will splinter into 5 distinct regions as a result of internal divisions stoked by internet arguments and inter-party conflict. Facebook, by the way, is no stranger to this, right? In Myanmar, the military there used Facebook to provoke mass killings of Muslim Rohingya population using reposted metaphors, memes, and calls to actions for violence. Once you start using metaphor to call people vermin and animals, the vehicle becomes this dark and scary place, and the tenor of our civil society is radically affected because it's being changed by those linkages. So we have to be careful of the sea and story and metaphor that we swim in, because over the next 5 years, it's getting worse. Why? We have large language models, known colloquially as artificial intelligence, but it's not. Science fiction writer up here, it's not AI, that can now generate basic communication. It isn't replacing writers and story just yet, but it's good enough that state actors can begin to use coders to start generating memes. In fact, on Facebook, I'm starting to see memes created by AI all the time. Right now, they're mostly fake images of planes or designs of home interiors or textual news summaries. But imagine an AI sitting there scraping news from the front of CNN and rewriting it with a focus on misinforming frames and metaphors, like we just discussed, that then pretend to be a local newspaper. I don't have to imagine this too much because it just started happening. There's been a mysterious explosion of Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, and websites that purport to be a local news source that are posting automatically generated news for a purpose that is not in your best interest. And it's very, very hard to distinguish between the two when you're divorced of context and you're just being forwarded a single link, or even worse, a screen capture of the post in question. If we don't truly understand the world around us, if we are making mistakes, then we can't make informed decisions. This is how things fall apart. It affects our ability to plan. So now we come to the last portion of this. This is all really overwhelming. And I hate it when speakers spend an entire lecture kind of sending doom my way. Yes, here's a pile of crap, but come on, help me out. Please give me a shovel. So the first thing to be aware of is that metaphors encountered outside of fiction are there for a specific reason. Inside of fiction, we're doing it for novelty. We're doing it to delight you, surprise you, help you see a fuller picture of something without us having to spend pages and pages summarizing it. The next step is to become aware of the moment you're being asked to pull a vehicle out of your long-term memory and dissociate it with tenor. When someone says to you, yeah, something is like something else different, it's good to start looking for the pattern enough that when it's given to you, you can see it, right? This is one of the benefits of being a writer. Whenever someone introduces a metaphor to me outside of writing, my writer brain always kicks on and starts to examine it. I'm always like, interesting metaphor. Can we talk about it? Can we unpack it? Can we look at the vehicle? Can we look at the tenor? What do you really mean? Is a person like a house? Really? Right? When you begin to discuss the artificiality of the metaphor, it invites the other person to also recognize that it is an artificial metaphor, right? That a metaphor is something compared to something it isn't. And if you can break the isn't, you have a chance, all right? I did that when I started talking to you about these bad metaphors, right? By asking you to properly think about the metaphor and to examine if there's really a one-to-one relationship, we can stop the metaphor from automatically burrowing into us without examination, okay? One of the reasons that so many psychologists began to talk about buried memories in the 1980s was because they were experimenting with breaking this interrupt cycle of how we form memories without realizing it. They were bringing up fond memories of a child's past, the vehicle, and then asking them if there was a tenor of abuse, and thus creating a connection, implying that there was a past connection to abuse. And then asking the child to put the memory away. And in the next section, when they resurface the memory, the child would have a connection of the memory to abuse. This was not being done intentionally, by the way. This was just that neuroscience was a baby, okay? Those people were realizing that lots of people had abuse in the past, and they were trying to see if people were forgetting about it, okay? But memories are not like Hard drives, that's a bad metaphor, okay? Hard drives have something called a checksum, where whenever you pull the memory out into temporary memory, it comes with a bunch of digits that certify when you put it back, whether you put it back the same way as it came out. Our brain has no such thing. This is why you can get together with people and have 7 different memories of something that you all experienced 20 years ago. Because over the years, you've taken that memory out, examined it, put it back. Taken it out, examined it, put it back. It has changed over time without you realizing it. First time I noticed this was when I went back to watch a movie by Stephen King movie, the one with the truck chasing that poor guy in the little car. In my memory, that truck is a modern Mack truck. When I went to see the movie not too long ago, just on a rewatch, it's a janky old 1960s semi-truck, not a gleaming new modern truck. Same thing with the show Airwolf, right? When I watched it when I was young, it was an advanced, state-of-the-art futuristic helicopter. Last time I went and watched a clip, I was like, that is a 50-year-old helicopter. That is not impressive, right? I've updated the memories in my head, and I've not even noticed it. So when I ask you to properly think about the metaphor and to examine if there's really a one-to-one relationship, that's one of the ways you can stop the metaphor from automatically burrowing into your long-term storage. The other thing that we can do is we can encourage more complexity in our lives. Right now in schools all over the country, students are taught about atoms using a nucleus being orbited by electrons image. It looks kind of like a mini solar system. It's a great metaphor. Atoms are kind of like mini solar systems, except they're not. There's this whole paper called On the Problem and Promise of Metaphor Use in Science and Science Communication. Sounds a little dry, by Cynthia Taylor and Brian Dewsbury, where they point out we're inundated with metaphorical language, such as genetic blueprints, ecological footprints, invasive species, agents of infectious disease, superbugs, food chains, missing links, and so on. But that isn't science. That's story and metaphor, right? Students even are given metaphors to understand how atoms work, turn out to have to be untaught that when they get to higher levels of science. And it creates a lot of confusion and suspicion and frustration with students when they're being asked to unlearn things that they've taught and buried deep into their memory and understanding of how the world works. We are lazy with our metaphors, and we have to get better. We have to stop passing them on. That retweet button, the repost, the instant passing on of something if it evokes emotion in social media is death to knowledge. That is how the lie gets halfway across the world. We're all helping it. We need to train ourselves to notice how outside forces use our very neural architecture against us. And to do that, we first have to recognize the problem, and the problem is that metaphors are actually dangerous. And I hope with that understanding and a little bit of curiosity, I can help you interrupt the metaphor cycle and be a little bit more resistant to mis and disinformation. Thank you, and thank you for your time, and I will now entertain any questions you might have. But if you're interested in digging deeper into the subject, I highly recommend On the Problem and Promise of Metaphor Use in Science and Science Fiction, or in Science and Science Communication, gapminder.org, which you can spend weeks on, and George Lakoff is a linguist who does a lot of work in this field 40, 50 years ago. It's just that I'm really concerned about the implications of mimetic transfer, metaphors, and our modern social media environment. Thank you very much.
So we now invite you to ask any questions that you like to the speaker. Please.
Yeah.
So, my English degree was a long time ago.
So is mine.
Is saying that metaphors are dangerous also a metaphor?
Yeah, probably. I think that
so that it makes it powerful, like.
this is part like where we like think too hard about it, we become the millipede being asked how it walks. And then it falls over. I don't know. All the legs on one side, all the legs on another, or lots of little ones, or do you ripple, or like how does it even work? Yeah, we can get deep into the semantics. And I think like for students, if you found this interesting at all, communications and linguistics is basically this whole world. You basically get to go study this forever and ever on end. And I really wish I'd gotten a linguistics degree as well as English, because it turns out that I love unpacking what words actually mean. It just wasn't a available to me. We got like one linguistics course with Tobias S right there, which is where the seeds of a lot of this were planted, mumble years ago.
Thanks for mumbling.
It was for both of our sakes. Yeah.
I'm kind of interested, so you mentioned kind of drawing the line between how metaphor is used in reality and also how it's kind of played with in fiction. Where do you think kind of, I'm not sure how to say, like the line is for that? Like where does it become like a story you've been told kind of transforms into a more real concrete belief, which becomes then, an actual kind of like propaganda.
I think that's an answer you can build a whole doctorate around. I think it's a spectrum, and that's a really long conversation that I actually kind of started to get into at one point on the draft of this and decided to do. But mostly, if I see it in print in a fictional context, I'm more willing to just let metaphors have fun with me. But the moment I see a metaphor in news media, on a news broadcast, or from another human being trying to describe something to me, I'm instantly suspicious, right? And I start to ask follow-up questions, right, to see if there's any semantic collapse, right? And I usually find that if you start to ask questions about the direct one-to-ones of whether something is actually why, you get that semantic collapse pretty quickly. So this opens up kind of a follow-up question. How do we stop these things from spreading? Well, one of the things is asking questions, right? So for a long time, I would, during an administration long ago, I spent a lot of time on Facebook arguing with people about things that they were saying that I found ridiculous. And one of the things is you can't yell someone into agreeing, right? And so it's been much more practical for me to just begin to ask questions about the metaphor that they've created. So whenever I see like a Facebook thing and someone says the governmental budget should be run like a household budget, I begin to ask a series of questions of that person, right? To get them to see that there's a semantic collapse. I'm not getting them to agree with me. I don't want them to adopt my politics. I just want them to recognize that what they said was possibly dumb, if not dangerous, right? That's all, right? They can continue to believe certain things about tax code. I'm not arguing with that, right? We can argue about the Laffer curve all we want, about where taxes should be set. That's a great conversation to have in a civilized society, right? But to say X is like Y, and then try to defend it, not this person, no. I'm just going to keep asking questions. I'm not going to say what I want you to think, but I'm just going to just point out that this doesn't stand, and just keep poking at it, right? Now that does piss you off when people start to look at you as kind of like a devil's advocate who always swarms in with awkward questions. But then, one of the interesting things I notice is that people stop using dumb metaphors around anymore. So at the very least, I'm less annoyed going through life in general. And B, people start to understand that they have to bring a well-researched game to me, right? Because I don't have to prove to them that my way of thinking is right. I just have to explore whether this metaphor holds up or if it's silly, right? And I found incredible success at just kind of like slowly plinking away at that. From reading about how misinformation travels around the world, one of the things you'll hear is that people say, don't bother engaging with people and arguing with them. It's not quite true if you read all the research that they're talking about and get further into the article. What they want you to do is not try to convince someone of your side. The way it works is we are kind of like a carrier surrounded by all these little destroyers of facts that we have, and metaphors that we believe, and ways we think things work. And the way that you kind of get at the carrier is you chip away at the destroyers, right? You just keep undermining until something semantically collapses. And when things semantically collapse, you have an opportunity to get in and have a real conversation with someone. Because the moment they say, you know what, you're right, a household budget is not a government budget, then you can basically open up a separate conversation. What are your values? What do you think should be funded? Can you start showing me where you're going to take money from and what the impact is on you, the citizen, right? You know, quite often someone will say, if you just get rid of all welfare, we can balance the budget. And that's why it needs to be a household budget. And then you can get into a further conversation of, well, how much of your tax payment is welfare? And usually ends up being something just shy of 1%, right? So I'm like, how much do you pay in taxes? $2,000 a year? Okay, so what's 1% of 2,000, right? $20. Okay, so All of this sound and fury is about 20 bucks. I don't have my wallet on me, but I'll give you 20 bucks if you stop saying that metaphor, right? So you get into that kind of conversation, you can have fun, right? Whereas the other one where you're just trying to argue with them and get them to see the facts, it's never going to work, right? They have to go look for the facts themselves. So we have to just challenge the metaphor, challenge the metaphor, challenge the metaphor. Yeah.
So you mentioned the problematic use of metaphors in science.
In science, yeah.
As someone who is studying a science degree, I can attest that it becomes very problematic.
Yeah.
How do you recommend moving forward for both undergraduate and graduate students, but also those of us that intend to go on to educate the youth?
That's a really great question, and I hope I give you an answer that doesn't like uneducate people or cause harm. I think what I do in class, because I use metaphors and visual imagery a lot to describe writing, is I foreground that by explaining to the student constantly that I'm using a metaphor that's not real, okay? To see if I can help you kind of get a framework of your own to see something. So I'm constantly saying, this isn't real, right? This picture I'm going to draw on the board of atoms and the way they work, this is fake, but it helps you get to a beginner understanding. And we can also embrace complexity, right? What I found is that there's a fear of being complex to younger and beginner students, right? So when I teach writing, my writing advice is universal. I do not step it down for an undergrad student versus a grad student versus a mid-list writer who's taking a workshop with me. The language and explanations I use are the same no matter what, whether you're a beginning writer or a later writer, because I want you to know that there's complexity in these answers. A lot of times my students will come to me and they'll say, Mr. Buckell, I'm struggling with this aspect of writing craft. I can't quite nail it down. And I'll say, congratulations, welcome to the club. You're here with the rest of us. This is hard. If it was easy, everyone else could do it. Okay? This is hard. It's craft. It requires mastery. Okay? So you're going to have to embrace some complexity and gray area here. There is no simple metaphor for how to do X. There's only trying and learning how deep this goes, right? I can't give you a really simple example right off the top of my head here, but that's constantly showing them that I live in a world of complexity and grayness with understanding these things, and that there's wiggle room. It frees them up to explore it without feeling like they're getting things wrong all the time, right? You're gonna mess up trying to understand these things, but that's okay, right? With my own children, I've had a great deal of fun seeing them explore complexity of, say, history, right? As a student, I despised history for a very long time because it was taught without any complexity. Dates, numbers, and maps, right? But then when I started reading some of the real deep history of what happened and finding all of these wild complexities, suddenly you were like, this is real, right? Yeah, no wonder we have such a messed up modern system. These guys back there didn't have it figured out either. They were just doing their best, right? They came up with a compromise and they screwed it up. And we have to deal with the fallout and try to do better, right? And that makes it something that we're all involved in, rather than just a dry set of stuff that came before that has no impact on you today, right? I'm constantly talking about, I'm looking at, when I read history myself, like these things that still affect us to this day fascinate me. Robert Moses built bridges that were too low for buses to drive through in New York so that they couldn't get to black neighborhoods. And those bridges still exist today, right? That is like, those impacts, history is not dead, right? It's complex, it's gray, it's weird, it's convoluted. And I think like when we begin to present that honesty, that willingness to embrace complexity, I think that's a powerful tool as a teacher, right? I think a lot of students love that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
What you're saying about complexity reminded me of Orwell, because in Politics in the English Language, he writes about the way, metaphor can take something familiar and jerk your perspective so that you see it anew. But he also argues to never, ever, ever repeat a metaphor. And maybe the repeating, the repetition flattens the metaphor and takes away the complexity.
Yeah.
So maybe a warning sign of metaphor is if it's repeated.
Yeah.
Government should operate like a business.
Yeah.
That's all you need. So that should be named.
That's a good one. I had not come across that one. Repetition is fantastic. I'm gonna have to stick that in the back pocket and add that to my notes. I like that. Yeah, that's great. Other questions?
Well, unfortunately, we have the room till 7.
Okay,
So
all right.
let's give a round of applause to Tobias. And one final thing, on behalf of us, we want to give you a little memento of the wonderful presentation.
Awesome.
There is a reception out in the lobby of Stanball Theater, so we invite you to attend and ask any additional questions. So on behalf of the Ryan Walter Media Studies program and the School of Social Science